I didn't hear the sound of my name that night. Not once. Not even when I walked past the living room carrying the last of my boxes, or when the front door closed behind me with that soft, final click. Christmas Eve hummed inside the house like a celebration I was never meant to join, glasses clinking, my parents laughing too loudly, footsteps passing me as if I were another piece of furniture they'd outgrown. I paused on the porch for one last look, waiting for something. My mother's voice, my father's old barked command, even a clipped, "Where are you going?" But nothing came. Not a sound. The cold air felt warmer than the silence I left behind. As I stepped off the porch with snow crunching beneath my boots, I realized something that hit deeper than any insult you don't notice when something leaves, only if you never saw it in the first place. I kept walking, breath sharp in the frigid air, each step carrying me farther from the house where I'd learned to disappear long before I ever packed a box. My car was parked 3 blocks down because they'd filled the driveway with my sister's visiting friends. Even then, no one wondered why my trunk was open or why my back seat was stacked with clothes and books. They had other things to pay attention to: my father's holiday bourbon, my mother's perfect table settings, the curated chaos that made them look like a charming, festive family. Not the kind that forgets their middle child is 24 and walking out on Christmas Eve. My hands shook when I gripped the steering wheel, partly from cold, partly from something sharper. Not fear, not regret, just the realization that if I didn't leave tonight, I never would. I sat there for a long moment, watching the lights from the house flicker through the trees. They looked warm from the outside, like a postcard, but they'd burned me empty. I turned the key and drove. The apartment I had rented quietly 2 weeks before wasn't much. One window, uneven floors, a heater that sounded like a coughing animal. But it had a lock that belonged to me. I carried my bags up the stairs one by one each trip, slicing another thread tying me to that house. By midnight, I lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling plastered with faint water stains. The silence here was different, honest, not cruel. It didn't press on my chest or punish me for taking up space. I slept for the first time in months without dreaming of tiptoeing through my own home. By morning, the world outside had faded into a soft gray, the kind that makes every sound gentle. I made instant coffee with the cheap kettle I'd bought from a thrift shop and stood by the window watching snow gather on the cracked parking lot below. My phone sat face down on the table. No calls, no texts. Not even a, "Where are you from, my mother?" A part of me stung with that familiar ache, but another part, new steady, felt relief. If they couldn't notice I'd left, maybe I no longer had to pretend I belonged. I had circled the diner down the street a dozen times in the past month, always telling myself I'd apply tomorrow. But that morning, with my bank account thin and silence weighing more than loneliness, I pushed the door open. The place smelled like frying bacon and old coffee. A woman with silver black curls piled high on her head looked up from behind the counter pencil tucked behind her ear. "You looking for warmth or work?" she asked. "Both," I said, voice small but honest. She snorted a laugh. "Start by pouring me a cup, then we'll see." Her name was Hattie, though she told me I could call her the only person who'll remember your name if you do this job right. She taught me the rhythm of the place pour, wipe, smile, repeat. By noon, I had earned $23 in tips and a blister on the side of my thumb. When I hung up the borrowed apron, Hattie leaned on the counter and eyed me carefully. "You move like someone waiting to be yelled at," she said. I almost lied. Instead, I whispered, "I just need things to be quiet for a while." "Quiet ain't free," she replied. "You work for it. Come back tomorrow." And I did, for weeks. At night, I'd return to my tiny studio above the barber shop next door. The walls were thin enough to hear clippers buzz and customers laugh, but it didn't bother me. It was company, not scrutiny. I'd sit at the rickety table by the window sketching things. I saw the chipped mug, the rusted fire escape the folds of my apron. Drawing made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, steady, capable, real. Winter blurred gently into early spring. I lived, simply worked quietly, breathed freely. My family hadn't reached out once, and though it stung some nights, it also proved something I needed to know. Walking away had changed everything for me and nothing for them. Then, one windy afternoon, a woman stepped into the diner who didn't belong. Pearls at her throat, gloves the color of ivory, posture straight as a story you couldn't ignore. She ordered tea with lemon and studied me with eyes that missed nothing. "You're new," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You have a steady hand," she observed. "Most people your age shake when they pour." "Are you an artist?" "I was," I whispered. Something softened in her face. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, sketched a quick, elegant outline of an old house, then turned it slightly toward me. Ivy climbing the walls, roof sagging gently, windows tired but full of soul. "This is my home," she said. "Marshwood Estate." It looked like the kind of place people gave up on too easily. She slid the napkin toward me with a name and number written in blue ink. "Call me," she said, "if you're willing to help a house remember what it once was." I stared at the napkin long after she left, heat rising in my chest. It was the first time in years someone looked at my hands and saw possibility instead of disappointment. I folded the napkin carefully, placed it under my pillow that night, and for the first time since leaving home, I dreamed not of escape, but of a door opening to something new. I called the number 2 days later, though I must have picked up the napkin at least 20 times before dialing. My thumb hovered over the screen while my mind argued with itself. Who was I to take on something as grand as Marshwood Estate? Who was I to imagine someone like Evelyn Marsh truly meant it when she said she needed my help? But something in the sketch, something in the way she looked at me kept nudging me forward. So I took a breath, pressed the call button, and hoped I wouldn't sound as small as I felt. She answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said, as if we'd known each other for years. Her voice carried that calm confidence older women seem to earn through storms. She told me to meet her just after sunrise the next morning at a diner near the marsh before she drove me to the estate. I wiped down tables that entire afternoon, feeling something warm and strange in my chest, anticipation maybe, or the first flicker of belonging. The next morning she was already waiting in a booth with 2 cups of coffee steaming between her hands. She wore a navy coat, her hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck. When she saw me, she gave a small approving nod. "You're punctual," she said. "That's the first sign of someone who can be trusted with a fragile place." We drove in silence for most of the trip. Marshwood rose like a memory through the morning fog, white columns streaked with gray, a sagging porch that looked tired from holding so much history, and tall windows that seemed to watch the world with a kind of weary dignity. I felt my throat tighten. It was beautiful in the way abandoned places are beautiful, honest about its broken parts. Evelyn walked beside me slowly, letting me take it in. "Tell me what you see," she said. I moved closer to a cracked porch column, touched the worn paint. "Water damage," I murmured. "Probably years of it. And the settling this corner's slipping." She studied my face instead of the wood. "Good. You notice what other people overlook." Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and old books. Sunlight pushed through tall windows in thin sheets, dust drifting like snow in the beams. The floors creaked, the walls whispered, and the silence felt full rather than empty. I walked through each room with my hands lightly skimming surfaces, wobbly banister cracked, molding warped floorboards. I didn't speak at first, letting the house tell me its story. Evelyn followed behind me, quiet and observant. When we reached the library, something in me paused. The bay window slanted outward, a hair too far, inviting drafts and trouble. Then I saw its initials carved faintly into the sill. M.E. My initials. For a moment the room felt smaller, leaning toward me. Who carved this? I asked, my voice thin. Evelyn stepped beside me, peering at the etching. Old. Early 1900s, perhaps. There was a Margaret Elwood. Or maybe another Marsh. Hard to say. Her tone was gentle, but I felt something unspoken hiding behind it. I traced the letters with my fingertip. "It's strange," I whispered. "Feels like, I don't know, like someone wanted to leave proof they were here." Evelyn's gaze softened. Houses hold memories when people forget to. She led me through the next rooms. When we reached the dining room, the table sat with only 2 chairs, as if the rest had been taken away or abandoned. The wallpaper peeled like tired skin. A mirror with a blackened edge reflected a pale, distorted version of me. "Could you restore it?" she asked. "Not just patch it. Restore it." I swallowed. "I think so. But it will take time, and patience. That's what I'm paying for," she said. A knock sounded at the door, sharp, confident. A man in a brand new coat stepped in without waiting for permission, smiling like someone who sold charm for a living. "Mrs. Marsh," he said warmly. "Wade Kessler, here to give you that quick quote I promised." Evelyn's expression tightened. "I didn't ask you to come today." He laughed as if inconvenience were a compliment. His gaze slid to me and dismissed me in the same breath. "And who's this someone who understands the house?" Evelyn replied evenly. Wade handed her a glossy folder with cheap bravado. "Front room's 10 grand even. Caulk the gaps, paint over the settlement lines, tighten the sashes with a screw or 2. Easy. I couldn't stop myself. A screw would split the wood, and paint won't stop the water intrusion. It'll rot from underneath." He smirked. "Sweetheart homeowners don't need every detail. They need fast results." Something hot rose in my chest. Fast won't survive 1 winter. Evelyn watched us both, then closed the folder and handed it back. "We won't be needing your services." His smile thinned. "Suit yourself," he muttered, swagger turning sour. "But good luck with all this." He waved a hand at the house like it offended him. When he left, Evelyn exhaled slowly. "Men like him build facades. I want honesty." She turned to me. "Would you lead the restoration?" My heart stalled. "Me? I'm not." "You are," she said firmly. "You see the truth without flinching. That's rarer than skill." I stared at the bay window again, at the house slanting but still standing, at the light that slipped through broken glass onto floors waiting to be cared for. I felt something shift inside me like a hinge loosening after years of rust. "I want to try," I said. Evelyn smiled, the kind that warms through layers. "Then let's begin." I walked down the long drive afterward, sun rising over the marsh and catching warmth on the windows. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a number I hadn't seen in 10 years. Dad, Mobile. 1 missed call. I didn't answer. But the knot in my throat told me this wasn't over. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the carved initials in the bay window M.E., like a whisper pressed into old wood. My initials. Or someone else's decades before me. Either way, it felt like a message I wasn't sure I was ready to read. By morning, I'd decided I needed to carry something heavier than fear. So I packed my sketchbook, tied back my hair, and walked to the diner where the world still felt simple enough to breathe in. Hattie spotted me before I even tied my apron. "You look like someone who met a ghost," she said, squinting over her glasses. "Just a house," I answered, grabbing the coffee pot. "Same thing," she muttered. "One takes your warmth, the other keeps your secrets." She wasn't wrong. The shift passed in a blur of clattering plates and steaming mugs. But when the lunch rush died down, I found myself pulling the napkin sketch from my pocket again. Marshwood stared back at me, all sagging lines and stubborn bones, and I felt the same pull I'd felt standing on its porch, the certainty that I was meant to be there even if I couldn't yet explain why. After my shift, I caught a rideshare to the estate. The closer we got, the more the world seemed to settle into place. The curve of the marsh, the hush of the wind through hanging moss, the long gravel path that felt like a threshold between what I'd been and who I might become. Evelyn met me at the door with a small smile. You came back. I said I would. Yes, she said, but wanting to and choosing to are different. Inside, the house felt more alive than yesterday, as if it had been waiting. I stepped into the library first. The bay window leaned outward like a sigh frozen in wood. Cracked paint curled at the edges, telling stories of sun and storms. I knelt around the sill, writing notes in my sketchbook. Evelyn stood near the doorway, watching quietly. "What's your instinct that the house wants patience before beauty?" I said. "Fixing the leaks, stabilizing the floors, repairing what people touch. Then we can think about everything else." Her eyes softened. "My husband used to say the same about people." I traced a hand along the sash where the draft whispered through. The wood felt tired but not hopeless. "This can be saved," I said. "It just needs someone to listen." Evelyn didn't speak for several seconds. When she finally did, her voice carried a different weight. "Then let's listen together." We moved through the house room by room. I pointed out the water stains mapping the ceiling like bruises, the hairline cracks near the doorway that warned of settling, the rusted hinges that creaked like old memories. Evelyn didn't flinch. She nodded, absorbing each truth the house offered. In the parlor, she asked, "Be honest. How long will the restoration take?" "Months," I said. "Maybe longer. Houses with history don't heal overnight." "Neither do people," she murmured. We paused near a tall cabinet warped by humidity. When I opened it, dust drifted out like tired breath. Behind the shelves wedged between wood and backboard sat a thin envelope yellowed at the edges. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. I pulled it free carefully. "Looks like correspondence. We didn't open it yet." Something in the air held us still, as if the walls were deciding whether to trust us. I tucked the envelope into my bag, feeling its weight like a stone or a key. In the kitchen, Evelyn poured tea into thick ceramic mugs. "I want you to lead this project," she said simply. "Not a contractor, not a firm." "I'm not licensed yet," I said. "I'm not hiring paperwork," she replied. "I'm hiring integrity." Heat rushed to my cheeks. I didn't know what to say, so I focused on the tea swirling in my mug. For years, I'd worked myself into invisibility at home and college, even at the diner. And here was a woman who saw me so clearly it felt like standing in sunlight after a long winter. A knock echoed from the front hall, then polite at first, then sharper. I set my mug down and followed Evelyn to the foyer. Standing outside was Wade yesterday's contractor, clipboard in hand, and annoyance written across his face. "Thought I'd drop off the final figures," he said. "Time is money after all." Evelyn's voice cooled instantly. "We won't be needing your services." He glanced at me. "Little Miss Designer here thinks she knows better." "I don't think I said." I measured. His smirk faltered. Evelyn stepped forward. "Good day, Mr. Kessler." He hesitated, then trudged back to his truck, muttering something that curdled the air behind him. When his engine finally faded, Evelyn let out a slow breath. "There are people who repair things," she said quietly, "and there are people who cover them." "That house deserves better than a cover-up," I replied. Her gaze lingered on me, thoughtful. "So do you." Late afternoon light slanted across the walls as I gathered my sketches. The house felt warmer somehow, its quiet calm wrapping around me like a promise. As I stepped outside, the sky stretched open pink and gold, the kind of sky that makes you believe something new is beginning. Halfway down the drive, my phone buzzed. I expected a shift reminder from Hattie or a payment notification. But the screen lit with a name I hadn't seen in 10 years. Dad Mobile. One missed call. Then another. I stood frozen, the wind tugging at my coat. He hadn't called for holidays, birthdays, graduations. Not when I moved out. Not when I vanished from his world. Not when he'd watched me fade at his table year after year. So why now? The phone buzzed again. This time a voicemail. "Marina. Call me back. It's important. For the family." Family. He said it the same way he always had, like a leash. I turned the phone face down in my hand. For the first time in years, his urgency didn't feel like my responsibility. The house behind me stood tall in the dimming light, waiting for someone willing to rebuild it with patience and truth. And for the first time, I realized I might be ready to rebuild myself too. The fog lifted in thin ribbons as the rideshare turned onto the long gravel path that led to Marshwood Estate. Morning light filtered through the branches of ancient oaks, their moss-draped limbs arching overhead like a cathedral ceiling. I leaned forward in my seat, breath catching as the mansion emerged through the haze, tall, weathered, and heartbreakingly beautiful in its wounded state. Cracked columns, faded paint, sagging eaves, a place holding on with quiet dignity. When I stepped out of the car, a faint rush of cold brushed my cheek. It felt like an exhale, a greeting, or maybe a warning. Evelyn stood on the porch, wrapped in a dark wool coat, her posture straight, her gaze soft. "You're right on time," she said. "I didn't want to keep the house waiting," I replied before I could stop myself. She smiled as though she'd been waiting for that exact answer. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and something faintly sweet, maybe dust warmed by sun through tall windows. The floorboards creaked softly under our feet, but not in protest. More like a sigh of awareness. I followed Evelyn to the central hall where shafts of light fell in perfect lines across a worn runner rug. "Start wherever you feel drawn," she said. My eyes landed on the staircase, first carved banister, polished by decades of hands, some steps bowed from time, others splintered at the edges. But it was the library that called to me, the same room where I found the initials carved into the window frame days before. When I entered, the light shifted brighter somehow. Dust motes danced like tiny lanterns in the sunbeams stretching across the bay window. The initials M.E. were still there, faint but clear. I crouched beside them, fingertips grazing the grooves. Whoever carved them had pressed hard as though desperate not to be forgotten. "Do you know anything more about the woman you mentioned?" I asked. "Margaret. Elwood." Evelyn stepped beside me, her hands clasped gently in front of her. "There are old stories," she said. "A young woman who lived here a century ago. Troubled life. Troublesome marriage. But beyond that, just whispers." "Whispers feel loud in this room," I murmured. Evelyn studied me, an unreadable expression passing through her eyes. "Some houses hold on to the people who understood them. Maybe you and Margaret share a kind of sensitivity." I wasn't sure what that meant, but I didn't push. Instead, I took out my notebook and began assessing cracked joints, moisture along the sill-warped floorboards beneath the window. "You know," she said, "my husband used to say homes with history require caretakers who listen more than they speak." "I can do that," I replied softly. We moved into the dining room next. The sunlight hit the faded wallpaper, revealing soft outlines where portraits had been removed, leaving pale rectangles behind. Chairs mismatched by age and style sat around a table that had once been grand. "Tell me," Evelyn said, "what would you start with?" "Structure," I answered. "Water damage is the enemy. Then windows, then load-bearing beams. And only then paint paper color." She nodded slowly. "You think in layers. That will serve you well." A knock echoed sharply through the foyer before she could say more. It clashed with the gentle rhythm of the house. Evelyn tensed slightly. We walked back to the entrance. Wade Kessler stood there again, clipboard in hand, smugness fixed to his smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Marsh," he said. "Thought I'd swing by with updated figures." "We didn't schedule anything," Evelyn replied, voice cool. Wade stepped inside without waiting. "Just thought it'd be helpful. Houses like this need immediate patching, not long-term theorizing." His gaze slid toward me, dismissive. "You again?" I kept my voice steady. "I'm helping with the assessment." "Oh, cute," he said. "But I think Mrs. Marsh needs solutions that actually work." Evelyn's expression sharpened. "Go on then, Mr. Kessler. What do you propose?" He flipped open the clipboard. Caulking the window seams, repainting, quick fixes. I could have her looking fresh for the spring season. And how long before the rot underneath worsens, I asked. He blinked, annoyed. Rot? Come on. Nobody needs that level of detail. That level of detail is what keeps a house standing, I said. And paint won't fix a water breach. It'll just hide it for 6 months. He scoffed. You're letting this girl talk you out of a simple job? Houses don't need emotional therapy. They need efficiency. I took a step forward. What they need is honesty. Something in Wade's jaw twitched. He turned sharply toward Evelyn. Look, lady, if you want to waste money listening to enough, she said firmly, we will not be hiring you. For a moment, something ugly flashed in his eyes, a resentment sharpened by bruised pride. Suit yourself, he muttered, but don't say I didn't warn you. He stomped away, gravel crunching like broken glass under his boots. When the gate slammed behind him, the house itself seemed to relax. Evelyn exhaled a long, steady breath. People like him cut corners because they don't care about legacy, or because they're afraid of doing things the right way, I said. We returned to the study where she opened a drawer and pulled out a folder thick with old papers, appraisals, sketches, restoration attempts that never happened. You seem frightened, she said gently, but you also seem ready. I hesitated. What if I can't do it? What if the house needs more than I can give? She placed the folder in my hands. Everyone has a beginning. Let this be yours. Her confidence in me hit with unexpected force. I swallowed hard and nodded. As I walked back down the path at dusk, the sky glowed with violet and gold. My phone buzzed again. The same name, the same number I'd avoided for years. Dad Mobile. One missed call, then a text. We need to talk. The world narrowed to that small, glowing screen. After 10 silent years, he suddenly needed me. But the house behind me, the one choosing to trust me, felt more like family than the voice waiting in my phone. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone when I let the message go unanswered. The diner felt unusually quiet that afternoon, even with the clatter of dishes and the murmur of regulars. I wiped down the counter, trying to ignore the weight sitting in my pocket, the voicemail from my father I still hadn't played. When my shift ended, I finally sat down in the corner booth with a cup of lukewarm coffee and pressed the screen. His voice filled the phone. Call me back. It's important. For the family. Important. Family. Words he used like fishing hooks meant to tug me back into a place I'd barely survived leaving. I dropped the phone face down on the table. Hattie appeared beside me without asking. What's wrong? He called. I whispered. After 10 years, she said, eyebrows lifting. People don't break a decade of silence unless they want something. I swallowed hard. I think you're right. She slid into the booth across from me. You're not obligated to answer. Blood doesn't erase harm. I nodded, but the heaviness in my stomach didn't ease. I walked to Marshwood afterward because being inside those quiet, breathing walls made more sense than trying to untangle old wounds in my noisy apartment. When Evelyn opened the door, she seemed to sense everything in a single glance. You look shaken, she said. I need to work, I replied. I need the house. She didn't ask anything else. Instead, she led me to the library where she'd laid out tools, gloves, and a small lantern so we could start clearing debris near the window frames. The work steadied my mind, scraping old caulk, brushing away dust, measuring gaps where air slipped through. While I knelt near the cabinet tucked behind the bookshelf, my hand brushed against something wedged in the back. A thin envelope brittle with age slid free and drifted onto the floor. What's that? Evelyn asked. I unfolded the envelope. Inside were letters, old yellowed, stamped with dates from years ago. They referenced investment commitments, delayed funds, and a partnership name that punched the air out of my lungs, Ellis Group. I froze. Evelyn watched me carefully, her eyes sharpening with understanding. My father's company, I whispered. She took the top letter, reading it silently. Her jaw tightened. I suspected she murmured, but I never had proof. Proof of what Evelyn hesitated then led me into the garden away from the weight of old walls. We sat on a wrought iron bench beneath camellia branches. "Years ago, your father made commitments to support the restoration of this estate," she said quietly. "He told my husband the funds had been approved from your trust. He said you'd consented." I shook my head slowly, cold creeping into my spine. I didn't even know I had a trust. "I believed him," she admitted. "We trusted him. But when the market shifted, he pulled out. Left us with debts we couldn't cover." I felt the ground tilt. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Because she said gently, "I didn't know if you were part of his lies, or another victim of them." I fumbled for the letter again. One line hit hard. "Transfer confirmed from M. Ellis Trust allocation." Beneath it was a signature, my name written in handwriting that wasn't mine. "He forged it," I whispered. "He used my name." Wind rustled through the garden, carrying the truth with it. We continued working around the estate that afternoon, but my mind never left the envelope. As we came around the front hall, we found the last person I wanted to see stepping through the gate. Wade. He held a revised estimate in his hand, but the false cheer on his face gave him away. "Afternoon," he said, eyes darting between us. "Thought I'd drop off updated numbers." "You're trespassing," Evelyn replied sharply. He ignored her. "Look, Marina, I'm just trying to help. Houses this old need quick work before deeper issues drag people into debt. People get desperate. People make mistakes." The forced sympathy in his voice chilled me. "Why are you really here?" I asked. His smile thinned. "Let's just say your father's worried you're getting confused. He says you've been talking to people about sensitive matters." Evelyn stepped forward, voice low and lethal. "Leave this property before I call the police." Wade held up his hands. Fine. But you should know Ellis Trouble has a way of circling back." He walked off muttering something I couldn't hear, my stomach twisted. The timing, his sudden aggression, my father's voicemail, it all lined up too easily. Inside the study, Evelyn handed me a metal box. "This belonged to my husband," she said. "He kept every record. Maybe something in here will help you understand the full picture." Inside were pages of ledgers, hand-scribbled notes about investor meetings, and a thin folder labeled Ellis. My hands shook as I opened it. The first page listed collateral assets associated with a last-minute loan. I scanned the list and stopped at the bottom. Grandmother's emerald necklace, bracelet, ring, all items I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. Her voice cracked as soon as she answered. "Marina, is everything okay? Where's Grandma's jewelry?" I asked. Silence. Then a quiet, trembled breath. "Your father borrowed it. He said he'd buy it back." "Borrowed it? From who?" Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She gave me the name of a pawn shop and then hung up quickly as if someone had stepped into the room. The shop was cramped, cluttered with old silver and forgotten watches. When I asked about the jewelry, the clerk nodded instantly. "Still here," he said. "Never finished the repair on the clasp. It's been sitting in the back for nearly 8 years." He printed a receipt showing the date it was pawned and the signature Greg Ellis. Not me, not my mother, him. By the time I returned to my apartment, every piece of evidence, pawn slips, forged signatures, investment letters covered my floor like a map of betrayal. My father had stolen from me, lied about me, used me as a shield and a bank account. My phone buzzed again. Another voicemail from him. "Marina, this is urgent. Call me tonight. And don't talk to anyone named Marsh." He knew. He knew I'd have found the truth. I sat down on the floor holding the pawn slip in my shaking hand. He wasn't calling because he cared. He was calling because he was afraid. The next morning I woke earlier than I meant to, the kind of restless dawn that arrives when your mind hasn't stopped running all night. My apartment felt too small for the weight of everything I had uncovered: the forged signature, the pawn slip, the letters hidden behind a cabinet in Marshwood Estate. I brewed coffee, but the bitterness only sharpened the unease. I needed answers, real ones, and there was only one place to get them. By 9, I was pushing open the glass door of the bank where my father had kept every account tied to our family name. The marble floors gleamed under cold lights, and the familiar scent of metal and paper hit me like an echo of childhood standing beside him, while he signed documents I never understood, always praising himself for protecting the family legacy. The teller glanced up when I approached. "How can I help you? I need to request copies of all signature cards and account activity related to the Ellis Trust," I said, my voice steady, despite my pulse racing. Her expression flickered surprise, then caution. "Do you have authorization?" I slid a letter across the counter. Rachel's draft. Clean, formal, legally airtight. The teller read it once, eyes widening, and disappeared into the manager's office. Voices murmured behind the glass, low and tense. When the manager emerged, she motioned for me to follow her into a private room. Inside, she shut the door gently. "We take concerns like these very seriously, Ms. Ellis." "I'm sure you do," I replied. She opened a locked drawer and laid out documents one by one: signature cards, transfer forms, withdrawal records. My throat tightened when I saw the signature my father had used. My name, wrong slant, wrong curl, wrong everything. "Who verified these signatures?" I asked. "The account officer listed here," she said, pointing at a line of initials. "But he no longer works with us." Of course he didn't. I traced the forged loop of my initial anger rising slowly like heat from the ground. "Can I get certified copies?" "Yes. They'll be ready tomorrow morning." Before I left, she added quietly, "I'm sorry, I truly am." Outside, cold air hit my face and I breathed hard as if I'd been underwater too long. As I walked toward Marshwood, the pieces began to arrange themselves in my mind: my trust, the jewelry, the letters, the forged card. Every thread pointed in one direction: my father was drowning, and he'd decided to use me as the rope. Evelyn was waiting on the front steps when I arrived. "You found something." "I found everything," I said. She ushered me inside, where sunlight pooled through high windows and dust motes drifted like slow snowfall. "Sit," she told me gently. "Start from the beginning." So I did. The bank, the forged signature, the manager's apology. When I finished, she didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for her phone, dialed someone, and said, "Rachel, we need you." 2 hours later, Rachel Torres arrived at Marshwood with a briefcase, a sharp mind, and zero patience for wrongdoing. We sat around the long dining table like war generals preparing for battle. "Show me everything," she said. I laid out the forged forms, the letters, the pawn slip, the timeline, the voicemail. Rachel's eyes scanned each page with laser focus. "This is systematic," she murmured. "Not impulsive. He used your name because it was clean, untouched. That's leverage for someone desperate." "So what do we do?" She slid a notebook toward me. "We create boundaries." I frowned. "Boundaries?" "Yes. Think of them like building scaffolding. You must decide what you'll allow, how you'll communicate, and what power you refuse to return to him." Evelyn nodded. "She's right. Stability begins with clarity." Rachel uncapped her pen. "We start with 3 rules made in public. Keep conversations under 30 minutes and allow no requests involving property, money, or access." The rules looked simple, written on paper. They felt enormous in my chest. And next I asked. We document everything Rachel said. Then we confront him carefully. A gust of wind rattled the old windows as if the house agreed. We worked through the afternoon drafting statements, listing assets, identifying contradictions in the forged documents. Evelyn brought sandwiches and strong tea, her presence grounding us like an anchor. When we finally finished, Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Last question. Has he contacted you again?" I pulled out my phone. 2 missed calls. 1 text. "Call me." Now. Before you make a mistake. Rachel exhaled sharply. He knows you're slipping out of his control. That's why he's pushing harder. What do I say if he calls again? She smiled without softness. You don't say anything. Not yet. I nodded, heart pounding, but steadier. Later, after Rachel left, I stayed with Evelyn in the quiet library. Sunlight faded. Shadows stretched. The estate hummed with the stillness of a place that had survived storms before. You're holding up better than most, what Evelyn said. I don't feel like it. That's because surviving doesn't feel heroic when you're in the middle of it. I looked at the envelope holding the pawn slip. My grandmother's necklace. A piece of her I could still get back. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, a small, fierce spark. I want everything returned, I said. All of it. Evelyn smiled. Then we'll get it. When I left Marshwood that evening, the sky was a deep, bruised blue. My phone buzzed again, vibrating like a warning. Another message from my father. We need to talk tonight. Your place. Don't make this harder than it has to be. But this time I didn't flinch. I powered the phone off, walked home through the cold, and realized he had no idea who I had become. Not anymore. The Saturday crowd at Brookfield Station Cafe moved like slow-water families in winter coats, couples sharing pastries, travelers clutching paper cups for warmth. I chose a table near the back one with a clear view of the door and enough space around me to breathe. Rachel's rule, never sit where you can't see an exit, echoed in my mind as I placed my phone face down and folded my hands in my lap. I rehearsed my boundaries under my breath. 30 minutes. Public place. No requests for keys, property, or explanations. No rewriting history. My voice felt steadier than I expected. The person I used to be would have shown up trembling, already apologizing. Not today. When my father finally walked in, he didn't look around. First, he walked as if the room should already be waiting for him. A tailored coat, polished shoes, and that familiar expression of expectation sharpened into entitlement. Behind him, my sister Mira trailed with careful steps, her eyes darting, scanning for judgment or admiration. She always looked like she was waiting for the world to applaud. He reached my table without offering a greeting. Clara, we'll need privacy. I chose the place I said. This is where we're talking. Annoyance flickered across his face. Don't be dramatic. Conversations like these require discretion. No, I said, keeping my voice low but clear. Conversations like these require honesty. Sit down or leave. For a moment I thought he might walk out. Then he pulled out the chair with a sharp scrape and sat. Mira followed, folding her hands neatly, mimicking his posture as if it were a script she'd memorized. The air felt tight around us. He leaned forward. You're overreacting. I didn't answer. Silence can be a kind of truth. He sighed through his nose. Fine. I'll say it plainly. We're in a temporary financial setback. We need a place to stay until things stabilize. Your place has room and it's closer to the people we need to meet with. I stared at him. You mean you need a place to stay? His jaw clenched. Family doesn't draw lines like that. Yes, I said. They do when lines have already been crossed. Mira jumped in her voice, soft coaxing. Clara, it's just for a little while. Dad's under pressure. You know how hard he's worked for us. For you. There it was, that familiar script. Sacrifice rewritten as justification. What I know I said is that you used my name on a trust transfer you never told me about. You pawned Grandma's jewelry. You forged my signature and expected me to stay quiet. My father's nostrils flared. I did what I had to do. That's not an explanation, I said. It's an admission. People at nearby tables glanced over. Mira flushed and leaned in, whispering, Please lower your voice. I didn't. Not this time. Why didn't you tell me the truth, I asked. Why did you think you could take pieces of my life and assume I'd just hand over more? My father straightened as if remembering a speech he had used on boardrooms for decades. Because you're my daughter, and daughters support the family. I almost laughed. Support doesn't mean surrender. His patience snapped. We don't have time for your theatrics. We need a solution. Today. No, I said. You need control, and you're not getting it. He leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing. You're choosing to embarrass this family. I'm choosing to protect myself. Mira reached for my hand, but her fingers trembled. Clara, if you don't help us, things will collapse. They already have, I said gently, just not because of me. Their silence tightened like a knot. I lifted my phone, keeping it face down. I told you the rules before we met. This is a public conversation. 30 minutes, no demands, no keys. He scoffed. You think a piece of paper means anything to me? It means everything to me, I said. And it means everything in court. That landed. His expression faltered and uncertainty rippled through his composure. I continued, Your lenders will contact you soon. The board started its internal review. The bank is pulling signature footage, and the pawn shop has already begun the hold process. His eyes widened, not fear, but recognition. He finally understood that the situation had slipped beyond his narrative. You did this, he whispered. No, I said. Your choices did. For the first time, Mira didn't defend him. She lowered her gaze, lips trembling. He inhaled sharply, gathering one last attempt at authority. You will regret this. I shook my head. I regret trusting you longer than I should have. The clock on my phone lit up quietly. 29 minutes. I stood gathering my coat. Our time is up. He lunged to his feet. We're not finished. I am, I said. I stepped away from the table, heart pounding but steady breath even. He didn't follow. Mira watched me with a fragile, fractured expression like a child realizing the story she believed in had missing chapters. Outside, snow drifted in lazy spirals, softening the world beyond the station lights. I exhaled hard, the cold air burning my lungs. Rachel texted. How did it go? I typed. The truth landed. Hard. As I walked toward Marshwood, the keys in my pocket felt heavier than before, like something earned, not given. And for the first time since Christmas Eve years ago, I felt the shape of my own life pulling into place. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving forward. The message from the board president landed just as I reached the iron gate of Marshwood Estate, the winter air sharp against my cheeks. His email was concise, formal, and heavy with implication. They had convened an emergency session, and documentation regarding the forged signature and unauthorized withdrawals had already been escalated to the bank's compliance division. A temporary leadership pause for my father was under review. I stood on the gravel path for a moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth beginning to breathe. Inside the house felt warmer than the air outside, its old wooden bones humming with quiet companionship. Evelyn met me in the foyer with a simmering expression that mixed curiosity and concern. You look like someone who just walked out of a storm, she said. I hung my coat and inhaled deeply. I met them. It went exactly the way you think. I imagine it did, she murmured, squeezing my arm before guiding me toward the library. Let's sit. We settled at the long table where papers, letters, and old estate surveys lay neatly stacked from our previous sessions. Sunlight cracked through the tall windows in angled slants, warming the faded rug beneath our feet. Did he push? She asked. He demanded. Then pretended it wasn't a demand. Then acted like I'd betrayed him. Evelyn nodded slowly. A familiar strategy. My fingers traced the grain of the wooden table, grounding myself. They want to move into my house. Her eyebrows lifted. And I assume you declined. I made the rules clear. He didn't like them. People who lose power rarely do. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from the pawn shop clerk. I played it on speaker. "Ms. Ellis, this is Tom from Riverway Pawn. I've reviewed the photographs and compared them to the items we have. 3 pieces appear to match 2 of them, untouched, 1 needing clasp repair. I can prepare official documentation if you plan to retrieve them. Call back when you can." The room went still. Evelyn folded her hands. 3 pieces. The necklace, I whispered. And 2 others. Not everything was gone. Not everything had been erased. "I want them back," I said quietly. "And you will get them back," she replied. A knock sounded at the front door. 2 sharp taps, then a pause, then another. Evelyn and I exchanged a look. "That is not a neighborly knock," she said under her breath. I followed her to the foyer. When she opened the door, a woman in a navy wool coat stood on the marble step, a leather briefcase in hand. Her hair was pinned neatly, her expression professional but not unkind. "Ms. Whitford, Ms. Ellis?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn answered. "And you are?" "My name is Hannah Grady. I'm a compliance officer with the bank. I received your counsel's request to verify documentation in person." Everything inside me tightened. "You came here?" She nodded. "Given the nature of the allegations, we expedite certain cases. May I come in?" Evelyn stepped aside. "Of course. The library is best." Once seated, Hannah unfolded a set of forms, her eyes scanning the edges of the table before laying them down. These were the originals from the trust account. "We've reviewed the signature card from when you were 18, Miss Ellis, and compared it to the card filed last summer. They are not consistent." A quiet tremor ran through my chest. Hannah continued. "Additionally, we found an internal override logged on the day of the largest withdrawal. That override required a senior officer's clearance. We are investigating who executed it." My breath caught. "So you can verify it wasn't me?" "We can," she said gently. "And we will." She asked for statements, context, records of communication. I answered everything, Evelyn backing me up with dates and her detailed notes. Hannah's questions were efficient, pointed, and methodical. By the time she gathered her folder, the sun had dipped low. "Next steps will be formal," she said. "You will receive written notice within 48 hours. Your counsel will too." She paused, her gaze softening. "For what it's worth? I'm sorry this happened. You deserved transparency." When she left, the quiet of the house seemed to swell and settle around me. Evelyn rested a hand on the table. "You realize what this means, don't you? That the bank will confirm everything, and that the board will have proof they cannot ignore," she added. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. "I didn't expect any of this when I took the job here." Evelyn smiled. "Life doesn't always give you the story you expect. Sometimes it gives you the one you need." My phone buzzed again. This time a text from Mira. "He's furious. He said you're making things worse. I'm trying to calm him down. Please pick up if he calls." I read it twice, then placed the phone face down. "I'm done being the one who steadies him," I said. Evelyn nodded approvingly. Later, after she retired upstairs, I remained in the library, the glow of the lamps washing the walls in warm gold. I stood at the bay window, looking out toward the black silhouette of the iron gate, wondering whether my father would try to show up here next. He didn't know how to respect a boundary. But I had finally learned how to set them. The house felt like it was listening, as if its walls held their breath with me. My grandmother's necklace wasn't gone. The truth wasn't hidden. And for the first time since I was a girl sitting invisible at a Christmas table, I felt the faint but solid shape of justice forming slow, deliberate, inevitable. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow things would shift again. The call from the bank came just after sunrise, the sky still pale and bruised with early light. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when the phone buzzed across the table. The caller ID read Brookfield Bank Compliance Office. My pulse kicked once hard. Ms. Ellis, the officer said when I answered, the footage you requested is ready for review. My breath caught. Today? Yes. If you can be here within the hour, we'll have a private room prepared. I glanced toward the tall windows of Marshwood's library, their glass still fogged from the night chill, and felt something in my chest tighten. Not fear, not quite anticipation. Maybe both. I'm on my way, I said. Evelyn appeared in the doorway as I grabbed my coat. She had a way of sensing shifts in the atmosphere, like the house itself whispered to her. It's time, isn't it? She asked softly. It is. Do you want company? I hesitated, but the truth was, I didn't want to walk into this alone. Yes. We drove through the quiet morning tires hissing over frost-covered pavement. When we entered the bank, the compliance officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, led us to a private room where a monitor blinked awake. This is the footage from the teller window on the date in question, she said. I braced myself as she hit play. At first, the view was grainy, softened by static. A vase with fake tulips sat crooked on the counter. A digital clock in the corner read 3:12 in the afternoon. Then he walked into the frame. My father, striding with that familiar confidence, leaning casually against the counter as he slid a folder toward the teller. He smiled. He joked. He chatted like a man ordering lunch, not altering a daughter's life. The teller brought out a form. He uncapped a pen. My stomach lurched. We watched in silence as he guided the pen in fluid strokes across the signature line, my name written in a hand that wasn't mine. The loop on the R, the slant, the confident swoop at the end. All wrong, all deliberate. My throat tightened. Evelyn touched my hand, grounding me without a word. When the clip ended, the officer paused the screen and turned to us. This, she said, tapping the image lightly, confirms forgery. The originals will be preserved immediately. I couldn't speak. Not yet. My voice felt lodged somewhere deep. Instead, I nodded. The officer gathered the files. Your attorney will receive the chain of custody documents by this afternoon. As Evelyn and I walked back through the marble lobby, I felt both heavier and lighter, like a truth I had known but never wanted to see had finally stepped into the light. We stepped outside into the cold. You don't have to be strong right now, Evelyn murmured. I'm not, I whispered. She squeezed my arm. Then be honest. It's enough. Back at Marshwood, Rachel called before we even reached the front steps. I've reviewed the footage, she said. We're moving forward. I'll prepare notices for the board and the bank's legal department. And Clara? This is solid. No one can twist it. For the first time that morning, I exhaled fully. After lunch, I headed to Riverway Pond to follow up on the clerk's message. The shop smelled of old metal dust and memories that didn't belong to anyone anymore. The clerk, Tom, recognized me instantly. You're here for the pieces, he said. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a velvet-lined tray. 3 items rested on the fabric, my grandmother's necklace, a slim emerald ring, and the dented bracelet she used to wear when baking. My chest tightened at the sight. She always wore that bracelet on Sundays, I murmured. Tom nodded sympathetically. The clasp on the necklace needs repair, but the others are intact. We'll hold all 3 until your attorney files the final papers. I touched the necklace gently, the cool metal sending a rush of memory up my spine, my grandmother's laugh, the way her perfume wrapped around me when she hugged me. I'll bring whatever documents you need, I said. On the drive back, snow began drifting across the windshield in thin, delicate sheets. Marshwood looked softer in the white light, as if the house were listening again. When we walked inside, Evelyn paused at the mail table. There's something for you, she said, handing me a cream-colored envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly, my father's deliberate, slanted script. I broke the seal with a cold finger. Inside was a short note. You need to stop this. Before you destroy us. Meet me tonight. No lawyers, no interference. D. My pulse spiked. Not fear, not exactly, but a memory of how easily he had taken control all those years ago. I handed the note to Evelyn. She read it, lips tightening. He wants secrecy, she said, which means he wants power back. I'm not meeting him alone, I said. Not ever again. Before evening fell, another message arrived, this time from the board's attorney. The footage has been reviewed. A formal suspension is imminent. Please be prepared for additional statements. The world was shifting faster than I expected, like a series of dominoes finally giving in to gravity. As night settled over Marshwood, I stood by the bay window watching the snow gather in soft drifts along the stone path. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory, sharp, commanding, rehearsed. But beneath that echo, something louder was forming. My own voice. Steady, clear, unshakable. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, he would learn that the daughter who walked away unseen 10 years ago was not the woman standing here now. And I wasn't finished. The next morning broke sharp and cold sunlight glinting off the frost that clung to Marshwood's windows like thin sheets of glass. I woke with a tightness in my chest, the kind that arrives when you know the day will demand more strength than you'd slept with. My phone buzzed before I'd even brewed coffee. A message from Mark. We need to meet. I have information you'll want. Noon. Station Cafe. Don't bring anyone. I stared at the text, my instincts prickling. Mark wasn't brave enough to act alone unless someone my father had pushed him. But if he had something tangible, something he'd been pressured to hide, I couldn't ignore the opportunity. I forwarded the message to Rachel with a single line. I'm going, but carefully. She replied immediately. Public place only. Keep records. Don't promise anything. By noon, I was seated at the same back table where I'd confronted my father days earlier. The air smelled of cinnamon and winter coats drying near the radiator. Mark slipped inside moments later, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like he expected someone to follow him. He sat across from me without greeting. You're blowing everything up, he whispered. I'm not blowing anything up, I said. I'm uncovering what's already on fire. He flinched, but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small black thumb drive, placing it on the table between us like a bargaining chip. This has emails, he said, tapping it nervously. Internal memos, drafts of statements your father prepared in case you misunderstood the trust transfers, even notes on how he planned to frame you as financially inexperienced. And a list of the jewelry pieces and their bridge values. My stomach twisted. Why give this to me now? Because he said, lowering his voice, he wants to pin it all on you. The forged signature, the withdrawals, the jewelry. He said you were confused that you'd agreed to some family restructuring and then gotten emotional. He's lying. I know, Mark said, brushing a hand across his forehead. And he asked me to corroborate it. Said he'd take care of me if I did. I stared at him. And what do you want? His answer came quickly, too quickly. For you to back off. For a month. If you stop pushing, he'll settle things quietly. He'll get your grandmother's pieces back. The trust will be restored, and you won't be dragged through the mud. I almost laughed. That's not a deal. That's blackmail with a bow on it. Mark swallowed hard. Clara, you don't understand how bad it is. The lenders are circling. The board's talking about legal exposure. If he goes down, he'll drag everyone with him, including you. Wrong, I said calmly. I'm not part of his collapse. I'm the proof of it. Mark's shoulders sagged. He'll ruin you. No, I said. He'll try. There's a difference. I reached for the thumb drive and slipped it into my coat pocket. I'll review it with my attorney. His eyes widened. No, you can't involve her. That wasn't the deal. I didn't make a deal, I said, standing. I listened. That's all. His voice cracked. Just think it through. I have, I said. You should too. I left him there with his untouched mineral water and walked into the cold. Snow drifted down in loose spirals, melting against my coat. By the time I reached Marshwood, my fingers were stiff, and my resolve sharper than the winter air. Inside, Evelyn was arranging paint samples on the dining table, but her eyes lifted the moment she saw my expression. "That bad?" she asked. "That revealing," I said, pulling the thumb drive from my pocket. She stared at it like it was a live wire. "And are you ready to open that?" "I have to be." We spent the afternoon with Rachel in her office, her laptop open as she clicked through file after file. Email chains between my father and a senior banker discussing flexible interpretations. Draft statements framing me as naive. Notes about investor optics. The spreadsheet listing the jewelry pieces with their bridge prices painfully low. By the third document, my stomach had settled into something cold and hard. Rachel leaned back and exhaled. "This is worse than I thought. He wasn't just careless, he was strategic. This is calculated fraud." She printed the most damning pages and sealed them in a labeled envelope. "I'll send copies to the board president," she said, "and to the bank. No more shadows. Everything above surface." My phone buzzed. A message from my father. "Family dinner tonight. 7. No excuses. Bring goodwill and your keys." The audacity of the request made my skin prickle. I typed back immediately. "Public place only. Station Cafe. 30 minutes. And I'm bringing nothing but my voice." His reply came seconds later. "Unacceptable." I put my phone face down. He's losing his grip. Evelyn nodded. And when people like him lose control, they push harder. "You must be ready." "I am," I said quietly. "For the first time, I really am." Before heading back to Marshwood for the evening, I stopped at an old hardware shop to pick up sash cord and brushes for the next round of restoration work. The man behind the counter offered advice about winter humidity and paint, curing mundane grounding words that steadied me more than he knew. By the time I reached the estate, dusk had pooled in the corners of the rooms and the quiet green walls glowed softly under lamplight. I set my tools in a neat row, letting the order calm my breathing. Then my phone buzzed again. A single text from my mother. "Your father is furious. Please be careful. And please, don't meet him alone." I touched the screen slowly. "I won't," I typed back. As night settled around Marshwood, I walked through the house, past the bay window, past the old mantel carved with initials, past the quiet rooms holding their breath. Tomorrow would be confrontation, revelation, the final unraveling. But tonight, I chose stillness. I chose my own weather. Snow was already gathering along the station roofline when I arrived just before 6:30, the lamps casting long amber reflections across the wet pavement. The private meeting room off the main hall felt too warm, too bright, like a stage set for a play no one wanted to perform. Rachel sat at the small table with a folder in front of her posture, straight eyes steady. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as anyone walking into a storm," I said. She smiled, just barely. "Then, let's weather it." The door opened at 6:31. The board president stepped inside first, followed by the bank's compliance officer and a quiet man with glasses who introduced himself as corporate counsel. Their presence made the room feel tight, as if oxygen had rules now. The president offered a polite nod. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Ellis. We'll keep this brief." I sat straighter. "I appreciate that." He opened the envelope Rachel had prepared and tapped the top page. These documents, he lifted the signed forms. The withdrawal slips. The screenshots paint a very clear picture. The footage confirms unauthorized activity. The bank's logs confirm senior-level overrides. And the internal emails he glanced at me confirm deliberate misrepresentation. My heart beat once hard, but my voice stayed steady. "I understand." The compliance officer flipped a page. "Given the volume of evidence, the bank is preparing a formal fraud investigation. You are not a subject of the review. You are a protected party." Protected. A foreign word in my life. Corporate counsel leaned forward. Internally, the board has moved to suspend your father from all operations pending the investigation. As of 7 p.m. tonight, he is barred from all financial accounts and decision-making authority. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, not in fear but in relief. So sudden it felt sharp. He will likely attempt to contact you, counsel continued. We recommend limiting communication to written form through your attorney. I plan to, I said. The board president closed the folder and folded his hands. Before we adjourn, I want to thank you. It takes courage to step forward when the person in question is apparent. I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. Rachel collected the documents, her calm like a shield beside me. If there's nothing further, we appreciate your time. The meeting ended quietly. No dramatic gasps, no slamming of doors. Just truth settling into place. Outside the station's main hall buzzed with the usual winter shuffle boots squeaking on tile luggage wheels, clattering in rhythm announcements echoing up into the vaulted ceiling. I walked slowly, feeling my breath deepen with each step. Then my phone buzzed. Dad, Mobile. I let it ring until it clicked into voicemail. Seconds later, another buzz. A message. We're meeting at home. Right now. Your sister is crying. Your mother is shaken. How could you do this to us? Come home. Now. I stared at the words, my pulse steady. He was still speaking as if he had authority to summon me, as if guilt were a leash he could pull at will. I typed slowly. Not home. Not tonight. Not again. Before I could slip my phone away, another message arrived, this time from Mira. Please don't ruin him. Please. He's terrified. Just talk to him. One last time. And then my mother. He's not well. I'm worried. Please come. Please. The pull of old instincts tightened around my ribs. Years of conditioning fix it, soothe it, shrink yourself. Rose like a ghost. I whispered, no, not anymore. I stepped into the cold evening and headed toward the bus stop. The wind bit at my cheeks, sharp and clean. Halfway down the block, headlights flared behind me. A familiar car, my father's black sedan, rolled to a stop beside the curb. The passenger window slid down and his voice spilled out low and furious. Get in! I stopped walking. No! Don't do this! His tone shook not with fear, but rage threaded with desperation. You're my daughter. I am, I said. But I'm not your shield. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. Everything I did was for the family. No, I said quietly. Everything you did was for your image. His breath steamed in the cold air. You think you're winning, those people you trust. Now they don't care about you. When this blows over, you'll come crawling back. I took one step closer enough for him to see my face clearly in the streetlight. I won't, I said, because I already rebuilt myself without you. Something in his expression cracked just for a second. A flicker of recognition that the child he'd dismissed had become a woman he couldn't control. You're making a mistake, he whispered. I shook my head. I'm making a boundary. The light changed at the end of the block, and a bus groaned around the corner, its brakes hissing. I turned and walked toward it. Behind me, he called my name sharp, commanding, echoing down the empty street. But I kept walking. When I reached Marshwood, Evelyn was waiting on the front steps with 2 cups of tea, steam curling into the cold. You did what you needed to do, she said softly. I took the cup from her hands, feeling warmth seep into my fingers. It hurt, I admitted. Truth often does, she replied. But you're standing. That matters. Inside the library, the quiet green walls glowed with the soft lamplight, steady and calm. I stood in the bay window and watched the snow fall, thin, slow, deliberate. Tomorrow would bring fallout. Headlines, maybe. More anger. More attempts to pull me back into his narrative. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt the ground under me solid, mine earned. And I knew I would not be moved. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of cold that made the air feel sharpened a thin bite against the skin. Marshwood's windows glowed softly against the winter dusk as I fastened the clasp of my grandmother's necklace around my throat. The metal rested just below my collarbone, warm from my palms, its weight a quiet reminder of everything I'd fought to reclaim. I checked the clock, 6:45. 15 minutes until the meeting. The board president had arranged a private dining room inside the Union Station Hall neutral ground with high ceilings and low lighting. It wasn't home, and that was exactly the point. Evelyn appeared at the doorway, coat in hand, her expression steady. "You're sure you want to do this?" "Yes," I said. "This ends tonight." She nodded and walked me to the car, her presence a silent wall between my nerves and the cold world outside. When we arrived at the station, the sound of holiday travelers swelled around us, luggage wheels, clattering children laughing, the hum of a world that kept moving, no matter whose life was falling apart. Evelyn squeezed my arm before I stepped inside. "You have truth on your side. Use it gently, but don't put it down." I promised I wouldn't. The private dining room sat at the end of a long corridor. I pushed open the door. My family was already there. My mother sat near the middle of the table, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. Mira perched stiffly beside her in a dark red coat. And at the far end, facing the room like a judge awaiting testimony, sat my father. His expression didn't shift when I walked in, but his eyes flicked to the necklace immediately, a brief spark of something like recognition or guilt passing through them. I took my seat without a word. "Thank you for coming," my mother said softly. I nodded once. 30 minutes. My father leaned forward. "This is ridiculous. This is a boundary I corrected." A long silence followed. It was the kind that used to make me shrink, fill in all the gaps, apologize for the discomfort in the room. Now it simply existed, and I let it. Finally, my father spoke. "You've caused chaos in this family." I revealed the truth, I said. "Chaos came from what you tried to hide." His eyes narrowed. "You think you're strong now? Wearing that necklace like you won something?" "It's not a trophy," I said. "It's what belongs to me." Mira shifted, tugging her sleeves over her wrists. "Clara, Dad isn't perfect, but he's scared. Everything is crashing down around him." I looked at her gently. "Fear isn't an excuse to steal from your children." She didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to her hands. My mother inhaled shakily. "Your father is being pushed out of the company. The board is preparing statements. We don't know what comes next." "I do," I said softly. "Accountability." My father slammed his palm lightly against the table, not loud but sharp enough to reveal the crack in his composure. "You want to see me fall? That's what this is." "No," I said. "I want to see you stop dragging us down with you." He opened his mouth, but I continued before he could reclaim the room. "You used my name on documents I didn't sign. You pawned my grandmother's jewelry. You tried to move into my home. And you expected silence because I've stayed silent my entire life." His jaw tensed. "Families protect each other. Protection doesn't mean surrender," I replied. "And silence isn't loyalty." The room stilled. I reached into my bag and placed a small envelope in the center of the table, certified copies of the pawn slip signature cards, and Rachel's official summary. "This," I said, "is the truth. And it's not going away." My mother's voice cracked. "Clara, please, can we at least stay together tonight? Just for Christmas." I looked at her, really looked. There was no malice in her eyes, no manipulation, only grief for a story she'd told herself for too long. "You can stay with me," I said gently, "but not in a lie." She swallowed and nodded, tears spilling silently. My father stared at the envelope, fingers twitching at the edges of the tablecloth. For the first time, he looked smaller, older, like a man who'd finally run out of versions of the story where he was the hero. "Clara," he whispered, "what do you want from me?" The question wasn't angry. It was hollow. I stood slowly, the necklace catching the warm light above us. "I want you to stop using my life as a safety net," I said. "And I want you to face what you did without expecting me to absorb the impact." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Time was up. I picked up the envelope and stepped back from the table. "This is where I leave," I said softly. "You'll receive everything else through counsel. No more private conversations." My mother rose, her voice trembling. "May I walk with you to the door?" I nodded. Mira stayed seated, looking as though the room were dissolving around her. At the doorway, my mother touched my cheek with a hand that shook. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have protected you." "You can start now," I said. She nodded, tears glimmering before returning to the table. As I stepped back into the grand hall, the sounds of the world flooded in train whistles, laughter, holiday chatter. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a world I was locked out of. It felt like one I could enter on my own terms. Outside, snow drifted softly across the streetlights, swirling like a quiet celebration. I walked toward the car where Evelyn waited, her face warm with pride. "How did it go?" she asked. I let out a long, steady breath. "Honestly, and that's enough." As Marshwood came into view on the drive back, its windows glowing through the snow, something inside me settled, a peace built from truth, boundaries, and the hard work of reclaiming myself. If you've ever had to walk away from the people who taught you how to disappear, I hope this story reminds you that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And it's strength. Tell me in the comments what boundary changed your life where you're listening from tonight. And if you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next chapter.